Picture this, whilst everyone's eyes were glued to the telly, watching Vietnam unfold. Another war was brewing in the heart of Africa. A conflict so brutal, so complex, that it would tear a nation apart for over a decade. This is the story of Rhodesia's forgotten war. And trust me, what you're about to hear will absolutely shock you. Now, let me take you back to the early 70s. The world was obsessed with the chaos in Vietnam's jungles. But down in southern Africa, something equally vicious was kicking off in the African bush. This wasn't just any old conflict, mate. This was a war that would pit neighbor against neighbor, black against white, and brother against brother. And like so many African tragedies, it all started with one man's greed. You see, back in the 1800s, there was this bloke called Cecil Rhodes. Proper old-school imperialist type. This mining magnate had his beady eyes on the gold-rich lands of Mashonaland. Using his British South Africa Company as a front, Rhodes basically muscled his way into the region, despite fierce resistance from the local Shona and Ndebele communities. Can you imagine the audacity? As British settlers poured in, looking for work and land, the company was handed complete control over the area's administration in 1895. They even had the brass neck to name the entire territory Rhodesia after their founder. Talk about egoing. But here's the thing, that'll make your blood boil. Despite signing numerous treaties with local chiefs, the stark differences in politics and land ownership between white settlers and the indigenous black population were already sowing the seeds of what would become a racial powder keg. This tension didn't just disappear when the region transitioned from a corporate venture to a self-governing British colony in 1923. Oh no, it festered like an infected wound. To distinguish it from Northern Rhodesia, they called it Southern Rhodesia. But the problems remained the same. The white minority held all the power, all the best land, and all the political control, whilst the black majority, well, they got the scraps. Fast forward to the 1960s, and Britain's got this new policy for African independence. No independence before majority rule, they said. Sounds fair, doesn't it? Well, not if you're part of Rhodesia's white ruling class. These people were absolutely terrified of what had happened in the Belgian Congo after independence. The chaos, the violence, the complete breakdown of order. They wanted none of it. So what did they do? On November 11th, 1965, Prime Minister Ian Smith and his white minority government did something that shocked the world. They declared independence from Britain, not through negotiation, not through diplomacy, but through a brazen act of defiance called the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, or UDI. As it became known, Smith claimed they didn't want to seize independence. It was forced upon them. Can you believe that? Here's a man representing 5% of the population, claiming he had no choice but to break away from Britain to maintain white control. The international community was having none of it. Overnight, Rhodesia became a pariah state, isolated from the world with only South Africa and Portuguese Mozambique offering covert support. But here's where things get really interesting. As Rhodesia sank deeper into this mess, black nationalism wasn't just growing, it was exploding. Political discourse shifted from peaceful protest to armed resistance, and two major factions emerged that would shape the coming conflict. The first was the Zimbabwe African People's Union, or ZAPU, led by Joshua Nkomo. Now, ZAPU claimed to represent all Rhodesian Africans, but it primarily drew support from the Ndebele ethnic group. These lads were proper Marxist-Leninists, backed by the Soviet Union, and they believed in conventional military structures. Their military wing, the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, or ZIPRA, was like a traditional army. They wore camouflage uniforms, had superior Soviet equipment, and weren't dependent on local populations for supplies. Then you had the Zimbabwe African National Union, or ZIPRA, which split off from ZAPU in 1963. Led initially by Nebaningi Sithole, and later by a young lawyer called Robert Mugabe, ZANU, drew most of its support from the Shona ethnic group. But here's the clever bit. They embraced Maoist ideology and got backing from China. Their military wing, the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, or ZIA, was completely different from ZIPRA. They specialized in guerrilla warfare, exploiting the rural landscape and engaging local communities in what they called a people's war. Now, opposing these two liberation movements were Rhodesia's security forces, and bloody hell, they were formidable. Initially, the British South Africa Police handled things with specialized units, like the Police Anti-Terrorist Unit. But as the conflict escalated, they brought in the big guns, the Rhodesian Army and Air Force. The army had some absolutely legendary units. The Rhodesian Light Infantry, known as Troopies, were renowned for their airborne capabilities and combat prowess. Then, you had the Rhodesian African Rifles, predominantly black soldiers commanded by white officers who used their local knowledge in counterinsurgency operations. But the crown jewel, the Selous Scouts and the Special Air Service. These elite units were experts in reconnaissance, covert operations, and high-stakes airborne missions that would make your hair stand on end. The first blood was spilled in July 1964 when ZANU insurgents ambushed and killed a white foreman named Andrew Ober. The shockwaves through Rhodesia's white community were immediate and severe. Smith's government reacted with lightning speed, detaining key leaders from both ZANU and ZAPU, including Joshua Nkomo, Nedabanini Sithole, and Robert Mugabe. All of them were sentenced to 10 years in prison. But here's the thing about revolutionary movements. You can lock up the leaders, but you can't kill the idea. Despite their leaders being behind bars and both parties being officially banned, ZIPRA and ZANLA kept operating from exile in Zambia and later Mozambique. The guerrillas escalated their activities into a full insurgency, and what started as isolated incidents was about to become a protracted bush war that would consume the country. Following UDI in 1965, the conflict intensified dramatically. Britain and the United Nations slapped embargoes on Smith's government, effectively cutting off international contact. But Rhodesia was resourceful, securing essential war supplies through South Africa, Portugal, and intricate smuggling operations that allowed for a surprising degree of self-sufficiency. The early military engagements from April to September 1966 saw a series of operations aimed at combating raids and preventing insurgent buildup. But by 1967-68, ZIPRA and ZANLA had stepped up their campaigns significantly. The Rhodesians responded with another wave of operations, and some of these engagements even involved outside intervention from Umkhonto, the paramilitary wing of Nelson Mandela's African National Congress. Now pause for a moment and think about this. You had guerrilla factions trying to destabilize security force control, win local allegiance, and establish bases for future operations. All crucial steps toward dismantling white minority rule. On the flip side, Rhodesian security forces, with vital reinforcement from South Africa and Portuguese forces in Mozambique, were desperately trying to crush this growing threat and maintain control. By the early 1970s, insurgent forces were operating from hidden bases in regions sympathetic to black liberation, mainly Zambia and Portuguese Mozambique areas controlled by Frelimo, whose own struggle mirrored what was happening in Rhodesia. Ian Smith's government was becoming increasingly aware of the collaboration between guerrillas and outside forces. Then came March 1972, and everything changed. Following a raid on Mozambique's Matamu base, intelligence revealed joint ZANLA-Frelimo infiltrations throughout Tet province. What was once a ragtag group of revolutionaries had emerged as a serious force, thanks to assistance from Beijing. Meanwhile, ZAPU was licking its wounds from previous defeats and had ceased active participation in the conflict, focusing instead on consolidating its position and sending militants abroad for extended training in Russia, Cuba, and North Korea. This development was deeply concerning for Smith, who in December remarked that the security situation is far more serious than it appears. On the surface, if ordinary citizens could have access to the security information which I and my colleagues in government have, then I think they would be a lot more worried than they are today. 17 days later, his worst fears were realized. ZANLA forces launched a daring attack on Altina Farm, and in response, Rhodesian security forces launched Operation Hurricane, targeting guerrilla bases and supply routes primarily in the northeastern region. This marked the first of many major operations to come, and mate, it was about to get properly nasty. Operation Hurricane involved a series of aerial bombardments, ground assaults, and intelligence-gathering reconnaissance missions aimed at tracking guerrilla movements. Whilst it achieved some success in reducing guerrilla threats, it also highlighted the Rhodesian forces' inability to fully secure border areas, thereby enabling ongoing guerrilla infiltrations and foreshadowing a massive escalation in violence. For 3 years, the conflict was largely contained to Rhodesia's northeast, but the guerrillas were growing in determination, experience, and discipline. They used whatever means necessary to gain the upper hand, and some of their tactics were absolutely chilling. They leveraged the influence of spirit mediums, conducted child abductions for re-education purposes, and deployed landmines with devastating effect. Security forces tried to counter this influence by imposing fines, creating buffer zones, manipulating friendly spirit mediums, and establishing protected villages, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with your bare hands. The guerrillas were winning hearts and minds in the rural areas, and that's where wars like this are ultimately decided. By 1974, conditions surrounding the Bush War had shifted dramatically. The fall of Portuguese-occupied Mozambique and Angola meant Rhodesia found itself grappling with an additional 700 miles of border to defend. Can you imagine trying to secure that much hostile frontier with limited manpower? It was a logistical nightmare. A ceasefire initiated by South Africa inadvertently allowed guerrillas to regroup, whilst also prompting the release of detained nationalist leaders. In 1975, South Africa withdrew its police from Rhodesia, yet the war decelerated as ZANU and ZAPU became embroiled in internal conflicts, targeting each other as much as they did security forces. Leaders were assassinated, left, right, and center. ZANLA, facing imprisonment of its leaders and an increasingly reluctant Zambia, shifted operations to Mozambique. Rhodesia enforced a dusk to dawn curfew along substantial portions of the Mozambique and Botswana borders. By early 1976, ZANLA had reinitiated conflict on multiple fronts, focusing on vulnerable targets and evading direct confrontations. To counteract escalating incursions in the Eastern Highlands, security forces launched Operation Thrasher, intensifying military engagements in this strategic region. Both Rhodesian and guerrilla forces adapted to the rugged terrain and evolving conflict dynamics, each vying for territorial control. With mounting pressure from every direction, Rhodesian security forces relied on their armed forces more than ever since 1974. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!